Welcome to Slavery of Shadows. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's untold stories. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments and let us know which historical event you'd like us to uncover next. Tonight, we bring you one of the strangest stories ever whispered out of the American South. Tales that hover between history and mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from, your city, your country, and the time where you are. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now settle in, remove distractions, and listen closely, because what happened on a Georgia plantation in the year 1837 left witnesses terrified, confused, and grasping for explanations that science, religion, and even fear could not fully answer. Second Slaves. If you haven't subscribed to Second Slaves yet, please subscribe and like this video. Your support allows us to continue unearthing the forgotten and unsettling stories hidden within the past. Stay with us until the end, because the child at the center of tonight's story would grow into a mystery that no one on that plantation could explain. The plantation stood in southern Georgia, surrounded by wide cotton fields and dense pine forests. It belonged to a wealthy planter named Thomas Whitaker, a man known for his strict discipline and quiet pride. Whitaker had only one child, a daughter named Elizabeth, who had been raised inside the tall white house at the estate's center. She was educated, sheltered, and shielded from the world of the fields. But in the summer of 1837, something happened that shattered the silence of that carefully ordered world. Elizabeth Whitaker became pregnant. No husband, no fiancé, no explanation. The household servants noticed first. A loose dress, long hours behind closed doors, whispered conversations between Elizabeth and her father that ended in shouting. The plantation doctor visited several times in secret, but no one asked questions openly. Because on plantations like this, truth could be dangerous. The child was born late one humid August. The birth did not take place in the main house. It happened inside a small room behind the slave quarters, attended by two elderly midwives who had delivered dozens of babies over the years. They had seen difficult births, strange births, and tragic births, but they had never seen anything like this one. Elizabeth Whitaker lay exhausted on the narrow bed, pale with fear and shame. Beside her stood a young enslaved field worker named Samuel, who had been forced into the room under orders from the planter himself. Samuel was the father. The room smelled of sweat, herbs, and burning oil from the small lantern hanging on the wall. Outside, the night insects buzzed loudly in the thick Georgia heat. The baby arrived just before midnight. At first, there was nothing unusual. The child cried like any other newborn, a sharp, thin sound that filled the small room. One of the midwives wrapped the baby in cloth and lifted her toward the lantern light, and then she froze. The other midwife leaned closer. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. The room remained completely silent, except for the baby's crying. Then the first midwife whispered something that made the second woman step back. The child's eyes had opened, and they were blue. Not the dull, cloudy blue sometimes seen in newborns. These were clear, bright, unmistakable, the exact same shade of blue that Thomas Whitaker himself carried in his eyes. Elizabeth saw them immediately. Her breathing became shallow as panic spread across her face. Samuel looked at the baby once and then lowered his eyes to the floor, knowing better than to say a word. Everyone in that room understood what those eyes meant. The child could not be hidden forever, but Thomas Whitaker had no intention of allowing the truth to spread. Before sunrise the next morning, Elizabeth was placed in a carriage and sent north to stay with distant relatives. Officially, It was said she had fallen ill and needed time to recover her health. The baby remained behind. Whitaker ordered the child taken to the quarters and raised quietly among the enslaved families. No one was to speak about the circumstances of her birth. The girl was given a name only once, written privately in the planter's personal ledger, Analays. But on the plantation, most people avoided calling her anything at all. They simply referred to her as the blue-eyed child. At first, Analays appeared to be an ordinary infant. She slept, cried, and grew like any other child. The women in the quarters fed her and cared for her as best they could. Yet from the beginning, something about the girl unsettled people. Animals reacted strangely when she was nearby. Horses grew nervous in the stable yard. Dogs sometimes whined or backed away when she approached. And then there were the lights. Several of the women swore that oil lamps flickered whenever Analays entered a room. At first they blamed drafts or faulty wicks, but it happened too often to ignore. The overseer noticed it as well. He was not a man easily frightened. He carried a whip and a pistol, and believed strongly in control and discipline. But whenever Analays looked directly at him with those strange blue eyes, he felt something he could not explain. He began avoiding her. By the time the girl turned 5 years old, the whispers around the plantation had grown louder. Some said the child carried the blood of two worlds that were never meant to mix. Others believed the circumstances of her birth had cursed her. But the most frightening stories began when Analays started speaking in her sleep. One night, a woman caring for her woke to hear the girl whispering words clearly in the darkness. At first, she thought the child was dreaming, but the words made no sense. Analays spoke about a wagon wheel breaking on the road to town. 2 days later, the plantation wagon overturned on that exact road when a wheel snapped. Another night, she murmured about a storm that would split the old oak tree near the fields. The sky was clear at the time. 3 nights later, lightning struck the tree and shattered it in half. The story spread quickly. People began avoiding the small cabin where Analays slept. Some claimed she knew things before they happened. Others said the girl was cursed, or worse. Yet Analays herself seemed unaware of the fear growing around her. She rarely spoke unless someone asked her a question. She spent long hours sitting quietly near the edge of the fields, watching the wind move through the cotton plants. And then, something happened that frightened even the plantation preacher. When Analays turned 8 years old, Thomas Whitaker ordered that she be baptized. He hoped the ritual would silence the rumors spreading across the plantation. The ceremony took place one Sunday afternoon beside a wooden basin filled with clear water drawn from the well. The preacher stood beside the basin with a Bible in his hands while a small group gathered nearby. Analays stepped forward calmly. Her blue eyes reflected the bright afternoon sun. The preacher placed his hand gently on her head and began reciting the baptism prayer. For several seconds, nothing unusual happened. Then the water inside the basin began to change. One of the women gasped. The clear surface slowly darkened. Within moments, the water had turned black, not muddy, not cloudy, black. The preacher stared down at the basin in disbelief. No one spoke. Analays looked quietly into the dark water, as if she had expected it. And from that day forward, the whispers about the blue-eyed girl became something else entirely. Fear, because the people on that Georgian plantation had begun to wonder if Analays Whitaker was not just a strange child, but something the world had never seen before. Fear spread slowly at first, like fog rolling across the Georgia fields in the early morning. No one wanted to speak openly about what had happened during the baptism. Yet every person who had stood near the basin that afternoon carried the memory with them. clear water did not turn black without reason. The preacher himself had no explanation. He insisted that the basin had been clean, the well water fresh. He prayed over the girl again the following week, but this time he did it quietly, inside the small wooden church, far away from the curious eyes of the plantation workers. Nothing unusual happened during that second prayer. Still, the preacher never again asked Analays to stand near the baptism basin. After that day, people began watching the girl differently. Some avoided walking near her when she passed through the yard. Others lowered their voices whenever she approached. Children who once played beside her now drifted away, uneasy, without fully understanding why. Analays noticed the distance growing around her, but she did not protest. She had always been quiet. Silence had followed her since the day she opened her strange blue eyes beneath the lantern light. The overseer continued pretending that nothing about the girl disturbed him. Yet he kept his distance more carefully than before. When he saw Analays crossing the yard, he often turned his attention elsewhere. Once, while checking the cotton rows, he caught her watching him from the edge of the field. She stood still, expression calm, eyes reflecting the afternoon sun in a way that made him uncomfortable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the overseer broke the stare first and walked away quickly. Later that evening, he told one of the other men that the girl's gaze felt like someone reading his thoughts. Analays spent most of her days near the quarters where the women worked and cooked. She helped with small tasks, carrying water, gathering wood, and watching over younger children. But there were moments when she seemed to drift away from the ordinary world around her. Sometimes she would sit beneath the old oak tree near the edge of the fields and stare toward the distant forest, as if listening to something no one else could hear. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that another strange thing happened. A group of women were washing clothes near the well when Analays walked slowly across the yard and stopped beside the water bucket. She leaned over the rim and looked down into the dark surface for several seconds. Then she spoke softly. "The river will rise tonight." One of the women laughed nervously. The sky above them was bright and clear, not a single storm cloud moving across the horizon. But that night, heavy rain began falling after midnight. By morning, the nearby river had flooded its banks and washed out the small wooden bridge used by wagons traveling to town. When news of the flooding reached the plantation, several of the women exchanged uneasy looks. They remembered exactly what the girl had said beside the well. From that moment forward, people began listening more closely whenever Analays spoke. Months passed and the strange stories continued. She once warned a stable boy not to enter the barn that morning. He ignored her, thinking she was only being strange again. Minutes later, one of the horses kicked loose from its stall and smashed through the wooden gate, nearly crushing the boy against the wall. Another time, she refused to drink milk brought from the dairy house. When the woman carrying it insisted, Analays quietly pushed the cup aside. Later that evening, several people who had drunk the same milk became violently sick after it spoiled in the heat. None of these events alone proved anything unusual, but together they created a growing sense that the girl knew things before they happened. Thomas Whitaker heard the whispers as well. Servants carried news faster than any wagon could travel. At first, he dismissed the stories as superstition. Plantation life was full of rumors and strange beliefs. But as the years passed and the stories continued multiplying, even he began to feel uneasy. One evening he called the overseer into his study. "Tell me honestly," Whitaker said, standing beside the tall window overlooking the fields. "Is there something wrong with that girl?" The overseer hesitated before answering. "I cannot explain it," he said finally. "But the people are afraid of her." Whitaker frowned, afraid of a child. "Yes, sir." The overseer shifted uncomfortably before continuing. "They say she knows things." Whitaker remained silent for a long moment. Then he dismissed the overseer and poured himself a glass of whiskey. As he stared out across the darkening plantation fields, he felt something he had not felt since the night the child was born. Unease. Because he remembered the midwife's face when she first lifted the baby into the lantern light. He remembered the silence that filled the room when everyone saw those impossible blue eyes. And deep down, he knew the whispers surrounding Analays would never completely disappear. Meanwhile, the girl herself continued growing older, moving quietly through the plantation world like a shadow people could not fully understand. By the time she reached the age of 10, the stories about her had spread beyond the plantation fences. Travelers passing through nearby farms began hearing strange rumors about a child who could see the future and whose presence disturbed animals and darkened water. Some laughed at the tales. Others crossed themselves when they heard her name. But those who lived closest to the plantation knew one thing for certain. Something about Analays Whitaker could not be easily explained. And the older she became, the stranger the stories around her would grow. By the time Analays reached the age of 10, the plantation had changed in ways that were difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The cotton fields still stretched wide across the land. Wagons still rolled toward town every week. Overseers still shouted orders beneath the hot Georgia sun. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm, there was a quiet tension that had not existed before. It followed the girl. Analays moved through the plantation quietly, rarely speaking unless someone asked her a question directly. She carried water from the well, helped the older women in the cooking house, and sometimes watched the younger children when their mothers worked in the fields. On the surface, her life looked like that of any other child raised among the quarters. But people noticed things. Whenever she entered a room, conversations often stopped without anyone fully realizing why. Animals continued reacting strangely around her. Horses shifted nervously when she passed the stable yard. Dogs that barked loudly at strangers sometimes lowered their heads and backed away when she looked at them. Even the wind seemed to behave differently around the girl. There were moments when lamps flickered suddenly as she walked past them. The flames would tremble as if touched by a small unseen draft, even when every door and window remained closed. At first, people tried to ignore these things, but the stories continued growing. One autumn afternoon, a traveling merchant stopped at the plantation to trade supplies. While waiting for the overseer to inspect his goods, the man sat beside his wagon, drinking water from a tin cup. Analays happened to pass nearby carrying a basket of laundry. The merchant watched her quietly for a moment. Then he frowned. "Who's that girl?" he asked the man beside him. The overseer's assistant glanced across the yard. "Just one of the children from the quarters." The merchant shook his head slowly. "There's something strange about her eyes." The assistant laughed uneasily. "You're not the first person to say that." The merchant continued watching Analays until she disappeared around the corner of the kitchen house. Later that evening, he refused to stay overnight on the plantation as he had planned. Instead, he hitched his wagon and left before sunset. Some said he looked frightened. But the strangest events began happening during the winter that followed. That year, the cold arrived early across southern Georgia. Frost covered the fields in the mornings, and the plantation workers gathered around fires at night to stay warm. One evening, several families sat inside a small cabin sharing food while the wind rattled the wooden walls outside. Analays sat quietly near the fire, listening to the adults talk about the coming harvest season. Suddenly, she looked up. "The tree will fall tomorrow," she said softly. The woman beside her frowned. "What tree?" Analays pointed toward the dark window. "The big one by the road." No one answered for a moment. Everyone in the room knew exactly which tree she meant. A massive oak stood near the wagon road leading into the plantation. It had been there longer than anyone could remember. One of the men laughed nervously. "That tree ain't falling anytime soon." But the next afternoon, a violent windstorm swept across the plantation without warning. By sunset, the old oak tree had been torn from the ground and crashed across the wagon road. When the news reached the quarters, several people sat in silence, remembering what Analays had said the night before. The whispers grew louder after that. Some believed the girl possessed a strange gift. Others feared something darker followed her. The preacher returned several times during the next year, hoping prayer might calm the unease spreading across the plantation. He spoke often about faith, about trusting in God instead of rumors and superstition. But even he struggled to explain certain things. Once during a Sunday sermon, Analays sat quietly in the front row beside the other children. As the preacher spoke about storms and divine judgment, the church windows suddenly rattled against their frames. The sky outside was clear. Still, the windows trembled for several seconds before becoming still again. The preacher paused mid-sentence and stared toward the glass. Then he continued speaking, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Thomas Whitaker watched these events with growing concern. He rarely spoke about Analays openly, but he kept careful track of the stories reaching his ears. At night, he sometimes opened the small leather ledger, where he had first written the girl's name years earlier, Analays. He would stare at the ink for several seconds before closing the book again. The truth surrounding the child's birth remained locked inside his memory, and the memories of a few others who had witnessed it. Elizabeth Whitaker had never returned from the north. Letters arrived occasionally saying she remained in poor health, but the girl remained on the plantation, and she continued growing. By the time Analays turned 12, the fear surrounding her had changed into something more complicated. Some people still avoided her completely. Others treated her with a strange mixture of respect and caution. A few even sought her out quietly. One woman whose husband had been injured in a field accident approached Analays one evening near the well. "Will he live?" she asked softly. Analays looked at the ground for a moment. Then she nodded. Yes. 2 weeks later, the man recovered enough to walk again. Word of that moment traveled quickly. Soon, others began coming with similar questions. A mother worried about her sick child, a young man afraid of being sold south, a worker concerned about a coming storm. Analays never claimed to know the answers. Sometimes she simply shook her head. Other times she gave quiet replies that made little sense until later events proved them true. Still, she never seemed proud of the attention. If anything, she appeared tired of it. One evening, an older woman who had known her since infancy asked her a question no one else had dared to speak aloud. "Child," the woman said gently, "how do you know these things?" Analays looked toward the dark fields beyond the quarters. "I don't know. They just come." The woman studied the girl's face carefully. "And the water at your baptism, do you remember that?" Analays nodded slowly. "I remember." "What happened?" The girl remained silent for several seconds. Then she answered in a voice so quiet the wind nearly carried it away. "The water showed what people were afraid to see." The old woman did not ask any more questions after that, because by then everyone on the plantation had already realized something strange. Analays was no longer just the child with the impossible blue eyes. She had become something else entirely, a mystery that seemed to grow deeper with every passing year. As Analays grew older, the plantation learned something unsettling. The strange events did not fade with time. If anything, they became sharper, more precise, as if whatever followed the girl had begun to understand the world better through her eyes. By the time she reached 13, people no longer whispered only about her birth. They whispered about the things she knew. It began one spring evening when the sun hung low over the fields and the workers were returning to the quarters after a long day of planting. Analays stood near the fence line, watching the sky turn red over the distant pine forest. A young boy ran past her carrying a wooden bucket, laughing as he chased another child through the dust. Analays suddenly called out to him, "Don't go to the river tomorrow." The boy slowed and looked back. "Why?" But Analays only shook her head and turned away. The next afternoon, several children slipped away from their chores and walked down to the riverbank to swim. The same boy Analays had worn stepped onto a loose rock near the edge of the water. The stone shifted beneath his feet, and he fell hard against the current. For a moment, he disappeared beneath the muddy surface before another boy pulled him back toward the shore. When they returned to the plantation, soaked and frightened, the boy remembered what Analays had said the evening before. Words spread quickly. After that day, people began watching her more carefully than ever. Some treated her gently, as if they believed she carried a gift that might protect them. Others stayed away entirely, afraid that the strange knowledge inside the girl might somehow spread. Thomas Whitaker noticed the change as well. The workers spoke about Analays differently now. They no longer called her simply the blue-eyed child. Some had begun referring to her as the Watcher. Whitaker disliked that name. One afternoon, he ordered Analays brought to the main house. It was the first time she had stepped inside since she was a baby. The large wooden doors opened slowly as she entered the tall hallway. Sunlight spilled across the polished floorboards. The air inside the house smelled of old books and tobacco smoke. Whitaker sat behind his desk studying her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the planter leaned forward slightly. "Do you know who I am?" Analays nodded. "Yes." Whitaker waited for her to say more. She did not. "You have caused a great deal of talk on this plantation," he said. "I hear things." Analays answered quietly. Whitaker frowned. "What things?" The girl looked toward the window, where the afternoon light shone through the glass. "Things that are about to happen." Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "You expect me to believe that?" Analays shrugged slightly. "You asked." The planter studied her face more carefully now. Those blue eyes were unmistakable. They were the same color he saw in his own reflection each morning. For a moment, something uneasy passed through his mind. "What do you see now?" he asked. Analays turned toward him slowly. "Someone will fall from the barn roof tomorrow." Whitaker's expression hardened. "Ooh, I don't know." Whitaker dismissed her immediately. He spent the rest of the evening irritated by the conversation. The girl's calm voice had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Still, he told himself the stories about her were nothing but superstition. The next morning, a stable hand climbed onto the barn roof to repair loose boards damaged by a recent storm. Just after midday, his foot slipped on the edge of the wet wood. The man fell hard to the ground below, breaking his arm. When the overseer brought the news to Whitaker, the planter remained silent for a long time. That evening, he closed his office door and poured himself another drink. The girl had not sounded frightened when she spoke. She had sounded certain. Outside, life on the plantation continued moving forward, but the stories about Analays were no longer contained within its fences. Travelers began carrying the rumors to nearby farms and towns. Some described her as a strange child who could see storms before they formed. Others claimed she could read books without ever being taught. One story in particular began spreading quickly. A teacher passing through the area once stopped near the quarters while delivering letters to the plantation house. He carried a small Bible with him, and while waiting, he opened the book and began reading quietly. Analays walked past and glanced down at the page. Then she began speaking, word for word, repeating the passage the teacher had been reading. The man lowered the book slowly. "How did you learn that?" he asked. Analays shook her head. "I didn't." The teacher stared at the page again, then back at the girl. He closed the Bible and left the plantation without saying another word. By the time Analays turned 14, the fear surrounding her had become something deeper. Even the overseers avoided confronting her directly. When she walked through the yard, conversations often faded into silence until she passed. But the strangest change was happening inside Analays herself. The visions were coming more often now. She no longer spoke about them as casually as she had when she was younger. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and sit quietly outside her cabin, staring toward the dark forest. One night, an older woman found her there. "What do you see out there?" the woman asked. Analays answered slowly, "Things that are still coming." The woman wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Are they bad things?" Analays thought for a moment. Yes. The woman followed the girl's gaze toward the dark horizon. "What kind of things?" The wind moved softly through the trees before Analays spoke again. "Fire." Then she added something that made the woman's heart begin to pound. "And soldiers." At the time, the words meant very little. Georgia was quiet. The plantations continued producing cotton, just as they always had. But Analays seemed to be looking far beyond the present moment. And somewhere in the future, she saw something coming that would change the entire South. Something no one on that plantation was prepared for. Something that had not happened yet, but was already moving toward them. The woman who had spoken with Analays that night could not sleep afterward. The girl's words lingered in her mind, like an echo that refused to fade. Fire, soldiers. Those things did not belong to the quiet life of the plantation. The fields were calm, the towns nearby were small, and war felt like a distant idea spoken about only in newspapers that few people on the plantation could read. Yet Analays had spoken with the same calm certainty she used whenever she described smaller events that later proved true. For several weeks, nothing unusual happened. The plantation continued its routine. Wagons rolled along the dusty road toward town. Cotton plants grew taller under the warm Georgia sun. Workers moved through the fields from sunrise to sunset, as they always had. If Analays continued seeing things in the future, she kept most of those visions to herself. But the strange silence surrounding her never fully disappeared. One evening, near the end of summer, the plantation blacksmith noticed something while repairing a broken wagon wheel. Analays had wandered near the open barn and was watching him work. The man had known the girl since she was a baby, and unlike many others, he did not avoid her presence. Still, he sometimes felt uneasy under the quiet weight of her gaze. "You stare at things like you already know how they end," the blacksmith said with a half-smile. Analays tilted her head slightly. "Sometimes I do." The blacksmith paused and wiped sweat from his hands. "Then tell me something. Will this wagon make it to town tomorrow without falling apart again?" Analays stepped closer to the wheel and ran her fingers across the wooden rim. "It will reach the bridge," she said. And then she looked toward the distant road. "Then the driver will have to walk." The blacksmith laughed softly and finished his work. The next morning, the wagon left the plantation carrying several barrels of supplies. By midday, the driver returned on foot, his clothes covered in dust and his face dark with frustration. The wagon had broken an axle just past the bridge crossing the river. The blacksmith did not laugh the next time he saw Analays. Stories like this began traveling farther beyond the plantation. Farmers passing through the area carried the rumors to nearby towns. Some dismissed them as superstition. Others grew curious about the mysterious girl with the impossible blue eyes. But there were still things about Analays that frightened, even those who believed she meant no harm. One of those moments happened during a Sunday evening prayer. Gathering inside the small plantation church, the preacher had come once again hoping to quiet the fears surrounding the girl. He spoke about faith, about patience, and about the dangers of believing in signs that could lead people away from God. As the congregation sat quietly listening, Analays remained near the back of the room beside the other children. Suddenly, she stood. The preacher stopped speaking. Everyone in the church turned toward her. For several seconds, she simply looked at the wooden floor. Then she spoke. "Someone will die tonight." The words fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. The preacher tried to continue his sermon, but the atmosphere had changed. Fear moved through the room like a cold draft. People began glancing toward one another, wondering who the girl might be speaking about. Late that night, the plantation was awakened. One of the older workers had collapsed suddenly in his cabin. By the time help arrived, he was already gone. The following morning, the preacher visited Analays privately. "You must stop saying things like that," he told her gently. "I didn't say it to frighten anyone," she replied. "Then why say it at all?" Analays looked down at her hands. "Because sometimes the words come whether I want them or not." The preacher studied her face for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been troubling him for years. "When you see these things, where do they come from?" Analays looked toward the church window, where sunlight streamed through the glass. "They don't come from anywhere. They're already there." The preacher left the church, that day more troubled than when he had entered. As the years passed, Analays continued growing into a young woman. By 16, she had become tall and calm, her presence carrying a quiet authority that made people listen whenever she spoke. The fear surrounding her had not vanished, but it had softened into something more complex. Many now believed she possessed a gift meant to protect others rather than harm them. But Analays herself seemed increasingly distant from the world around her. The visions were becoming stronger. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night trembling, whispering about distant fires burning across fields she had never seen. Other times she described soldiers marching across dusty roads under gray skies. No one understood what those images meant. Yet the years that followed would slowly reveal the truth behind them. Because far beyond the quiet cotton fields of Georgia, the nation itself was beginning to change. Arguments about slavery were growing louder in northern cities. Newspapers spoke of tensions rising between states. Politicians argued in crowded halls about laws that threatened to divide the country. Those arguments felt far away from the plantation, but Analays seemed to see something approaching long before anyone else. One evening, she stood again beneath the old oak stump where the fallen tree once stood. The sun was setting behind the forest, casting long shadows across the fields. An elderly woman approached her slowly. "You're looking at the future again, aren't you?" the woman asked. Analays nodded. "Is it the same thing you saw before?"
"Yes. What do you see this time?"
Analays's blue eyes reflected the deep orange light of the sunset. "I see the plantations burning," she said softly. The woman's breath caught in her throat. And the soldiers. Analays looked toward the distant road leading away from the plantation. They're coming closer now. The wind rustled through the cotton plants around them. For the first time since Analays was born, the future she saw was no longer far away. It was moving toward them slowly but steadily. And when it finally arrived, the strange girl, who had frightened the plantation with her visions, would become something else entirely. Someone people would remember long after the war she had already begun to see. The years that followed moved slowly across the Georgia countryside. But the tension Analays had spoken about seemed to grow quietly in the background of everything. By the time she turned 17, the plantation no longer felt like the same place it had been during her childhood. People still worked the cotton rows, and wagons still traveled the dirt road toward town. Yet conversations had begun to change. Men spoke more often about politics, about northern states, about speeches made in distant cities that fewer of them had ever visited. Analays listened to those conversations without joining them. She had grown into a tall young woman with the same calm presence that had unsettled people since the day she was born. Her blue eyes remained impossible to ignore. When sunlight touched them, they reflected a brightness that reminded many of Thomas Whitaker himself. Some said the resemblance had become stronger with age. Whitaker noticed it too. From time to time, he would see Analays crossing the yard and pause wherever he stood. The girl carried the same quiet confidence that Elizabeth had once shown as a child. Yet there was something deeper in Analays, something that made even Whitaker feel uneasy when she looked at him. He rarely spoke to her anymore, but he watched. By now, the rumors surrounding Analays had spread far beyond the plantation. Travelers occasionally arrived, hoping to see the mysterious girl for themselves. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they believed she possessed some strange power. Whitaker refused them all. The plantation gates remained closed to outsiders asking about her. Still, stories traveled faster than fences could stop them. Some said Analays could see storms days before they arrived. Others claimed she had predicted accidents and saved lives. A few whispered darker things. Stories about animals behaving strangely near her or shadows moving where no light should exist. Analays never encouraged those stories. In truth, she had begun speaking less and less about the visions that came to her. They were no longer simple warnings about falling trees or broken wagons. The images she saw now were larger and more troubling. Fire, smoke rising across fields, men in uniforms marching across unfamiliar roads. Sometimes the visions came so suddenly that they left her breathless. One evening, she collapsed while carrying water from the well. The bucket rolled across the ground as the women nearby rushed to help her. When Analays opened her eyes again, she looked terrified. "What did you see?" one of the women asked. Analays struggled to sit upright. "Cities burning," she whispered. "Whose cities?"
I don't know.
The woman helping her frowned. Maybe it was just a dream. But Analays shook her head slowly. It wasn't a dream. Later that night, she walked alone toward the edge of the plantation fields where the forest began. The sky above was dark and full of stars. The air carried the warm scent of summer grass and pine. She stood there for a long time, looking toward the horizon. Footsteps approached quietly behind her. It was the preacher. He had grown older since the day he first tried to baptize her. Gray hair now lined the edges of his beard, and his voice carried the weight of years spent listening to the fears of others. "You're seeing something again," he said gently.
Analays nodded.
Yes.
"What is it this time?" She hesitated. "War." The preacher's face grew serious. "You are certain?"
Yes.
He looked toward the quiet field stretching into darkness. This country has always argued. Arguments don't always become war. Analays did not answer immediately. Then she said something that made the preacher feel a chill move through his chest. "This one will." For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, the preacher asked the question that had been growing in his mind for years. "When you see these things, do you ever see yourself?" Analays looked down at the ground. "Sometimes." "And what happens to you?" She remained silent for so long that the preacher thought she might not answer. But then she spoke. "I leave this place." The preacher exhaled slowly. "Do you know where you go?" "No. But I know it happens when the soldiers have arrived." The wind moved gently through the cotton plants nearby, making the fields whisper softly in the darkness. The preacher looked back toward the plantation house, standing tall above the fields. If the girls' visions were true, the quiet world they knew was about to change forever. And somehow Analays seemed to be standing at the edge of that future long before anyone else could see it. As the months passed, tension across the country continued growing. Newspapers arriving in nearby towns spoke about heated debates between northern and southern states. Politicians argued about laws and rights that most plantation workers could barely understand. Yet Analays watched those events unfold with the strange calm of someone who had already glimpsed where they were leading. One afternoon, she stood beside the road leading away from the plantation. A group of men from town had stopped nearby, discussing the latest news from Washington. "The country is splitting apart," one of them said. "Maybe it needs to," another replied. Analays listened quietly before turning back toward the fields. She already knew what those arguments would become. War was coming. And when it finally reached the Georgia countryside, the mysterious girl with the impossible blue eyes would no longer remain hidden among the whispers of one plantation. Because the world beyond those fields was about to change. And Analays had been watching it arrive for years. The winter that followed felt heavier than any season before it. Even those who paid little attention to politics could sense that something across the country was shifting. Travelers arriving from nearby towns carried news that sounded increasingly troubling. Arguments in distant government halls had turned bitter. Newspapers spoke openly about states threatening to leave the Union. Some men dismissed the talk as politics, but others watched the horizon with quiet worry. Analays listened to those conversations the way she always had, silently and carefully. By the time she turned 18, she no longer seemed like the strange child people once whispered about. She had become a young woman with a calm presence that drew attention wherever she walked. Yet the mystery surrounding her had not faded. If anything, it had grown deeper with age. Her visions had changed as well. They no longer came as scattered warnings about small accidents or storms. Now they arrived in long, vivid flashes that left her shaken. She began seeing images she had never experienced before. Lines of soldiers moving through smoke, buildings burning beneath dark skies, and fields that looked disturbingly like the ones surrounding the plantation. One evening, Analays was sitting near the edge of the cotton rows when the overseer approached. He had grown older since the day she first frightened him as a child, but the unease in his voice remained. "You're staring off again," he said. She did not turn toward him. "I see something." "What now?" he asked. Analays pointed toward the road leading into the plantation. "They will come from that direction." The overseer followed her gaze, but saw nothing except dust drifting across the empty road. "Who will? Soldiers." The overseer laughed uneasily. "There ain't going to be soldiers marching through these fields." But Analays's expression did not change. "Yes," she said quietly. "There will." Within a year, her words began proving true. In the spring of 1861, news reached Georgia that war had finally broken out. Southern states had begun separating from the Union, and soldiers were gathering across the South. Towns that once felt quiet now filled with men preparing for battle. The plantation changed quickly after that. Young white men from nearby farms joined military units. Wagons carrying supplies rolled along the road more frequently. Rumors spread about battles happening in places few of the workers had ever heard of. Analays watched these events unfold with the same calm she had always shown. She had already seen them. But something about the future was still changing in ways even she had not expected. The visions grew stronger. Sometimes she woke before dawn trembling after seeing entire towns burning in the distance. Other nights she spoke quietly in her sleep, about long columns of soldiers moving through the forests. One night the preacher found her again standing near the edge of the plantation fields. "You seen something new?" he said. Analays nodded slowly. "They're closer now. The soldiers."
Where's?
The preacher looked toward the dark road leading through the trees. "Do you see what happens when they arrive?" For a moment, Analays did not answer. Then she said something that made the preacher's chest tighten. "The plantation ends." The wind moved through the cotton plants like a whisper. "And how?" he asked carefully. "Fire," Analays said, "and people leaving." The preacher lowered his head. "You mean freedom?" Analays did not answer directly, but the silence between them carried its own meaning. Months later, the war finally reached Georgia. Union soldiers began moving through parts of the state, burning supply depots, and taking control of towns along their path. Word spread quickly that entire plantations were being abandoned as enslaved people fled toward the approaching army. One afternoon, a distant rumble echoed across the fields. At first, it sounded like thunder, but the sky was clear. Then dust appeared along the road. A line of soldiers marched slowly toward the plantation gates. The overseer rode forward nervously to meet them, while workers gathered quietly near the quarters, watching from a distance. Analays stood beside the old oak stump where the fallen tree once stood. She had seen this moment long before anyone else. Smoke already drifted faintly from the far end of the property, where soldiers had begun burning storage sheds used to hold cotton. The plantation world that had existed all her life was ending exactly the way she had described years earlier: fire, soldiers, and people leaving. The preacher approached her slowly as the sound of marching boots filled the air. "You saw this," he said softly. Analays watched the soldiers moving through the fields.
Yes.
"Is this the moment when you leave?" She looked toward the road stretching beyond the plantation. "Yes." The preacher studied her face for a long moment. "Where will you go?" Analays's blue eyes reflected the flames rising in the distance. "I'll follow the road." Without another word, she began walking toward the line of soldiers moving across the fields. Behind her, the plantation burned. Ahead of her stretched a world she had already glimpsed in fragments for years. A world where the mysterious girl with the impossible blue eyes would no longer be just a rumor whispered among frightened workers. She would become something else. A story people carried far beyond the Georgia fields, where she had first opened her eyes under lantern light, because long after the war ended, people would still speak quietly about the girl who seemed to see the future before it arrived. The girl science could never fully explain. Analays. The soldiers who entered the plantation that afternoon were unlike any men the workers had seen before. Their uniforms were dusty from long marches, their faces worn from months of war. Some moved quickly through the barns and storage buildings, searching for supplies. Others stood watch along the road while officers spoke with the plantation overseer. For the people who had lived their entire lives under the plantation system, the moment felt unreal. Some stood frozen, unsure what they were allowed to do. Others whispered quietly, afraid that freedom might disappear if they moved too quickly. Analays did not hesitate. She walked slowly toward the soldiers with the calm certainty she had carried since childhood. The preacher followed a few steps behind her, watching carefully as the young woman approached the unfamiliar men. One of the soldiers noticed her first. He looked surprised to see someone walking so confidently toward the military column, while smoke from burning cotton sheds drifted through the air. "You from here?" the soldier asked. Analays nodded. "Yes." The soldier studied her for a moment, noticing the strange blue eyes that had unsettled people for years. "You folks are free now," he said. The words hung in the air like something fragile. Analays looked past him toward the road stretching beyond the plantation. "I know," she replied. Behind her, more workers had begun gathering near the edge of the yard. Some stepped forward cautiously, still unsure whether the soldier's promise could truly be believed. But the plantation house was already being searched, and the barns continued burning at the far end of the property. The old world was collapsing quickly. The preacher finally spoke. "Where will you go?" he asked. Analays looked toward the distant horizon north. She said quietly. The preacher frowned slightly. "You've seen something there?" "Yes." "What is it?" Analays hesitated before answering. People who need to hear things before they happen. The preacher understood what she meant. For years, the girl had lived among people who feared the strange visions she carried. But beyond the plantation, there might be places where those visions could be used differently, perhaps even welcomed. As the afternoon passed, groups of newly freed people began leaving the plantation in small clusters. Some followed the soldiers. Others walked toward nearby towns, hoping to find family members who had been sold away years earlier. The road that once carried wagons full of cotton now filled with people, carrying small bundles of belongings and uncertain hopes. Analays joined them as the sun began lowering toward the trees. Before she stepped onto the road, she turned once more toward the plantation behind her. Smoke drifted upward into the evening sky, where the storage buildings continued burning. That place had been the center of every strange story about her life. It was also where her story ended, and where something else began. The preacher stood beside her quietly. "Do you still see the future the same way?" he asked. Analays looked toward the fading light on the horizon.
"Yes."
"And what do you see now?" For several seconds she remained silent. Then she answered, "I see a long road. Is it a hard road?" "Yes, but it leads somewhere important." The preacher nodded slowly. "Then you should follow it." Analays stepped onto the dusty path and joined the others, moving northward. The war continued raging across the country for several more years, reshaping cities, towns, and countless lives. During that time, many stories began circulating among the people traveling through refugee camps and freedmen settlements. Stories about a young woman with clear blue eyes who sometimes warned people about storms before they arrived. Stories about someone who predicted dangerous crossings along swollen rivers or told soldiers when enemy patrols were approaching nearby roads. The details of those stories changed depending on who told them, but one part remained consistent. Wherever Analays traveled, strange things seemed to follow. Animals still reacted uneasily to her presence. Oil lamps sometimes flickered when she entered a room. And from time to time, she would wake during the night and speak quietly about events that had not yet happened. No one ever found a scientific explanation for the girl born on a Georgia plantation in 1837, whose blue eyes stopped midwives from breathing. Some said she carried a rare gift passed down through generations. Others believed she had simply learned to read the world more carefully than most people ever could. But those who had known her since childhood believed something else entirely. They believed Analays Whitaker had been born with the strange ability to stand slightly ahead of time itself, to see pieces of tomorrow while everyone else was still living inside today. And long after the war ended, people across the South would continue sharing the story of the girl science could never explain. The girl who had once frightened an entire plantation simply by opening her eyes.